somewhere in America right now. A small business owner is quietly watching their sales numbers fall, not because demand is gone, but because of a single line item most customers never even notice. A tax. A tax that, in some states, now takes more than one out of every $10 spent at the counter. And it's not slowing down, it's spreading, quietly, state by state, shop by shop. Some dealers are already restructuring their entire business just to survive it. Others don't see it coming until it's too late. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how this tax works, who it's already destroying, and whether your state or your money could be next. Welcome back to Precious Metals Intelligence, the channel dedicated to breaking down the economic forces quietly reshaping the gold and silver industry before they make headlines everywhere else. If you're new here, glad to have you. Before this story unfolds, it would help to know where in the world tonight's audience is watching from. So feel free to drop your city or state in the comments. It's always worth seeing just how far this conversation reaches. In small shops across the country, a quiet problem is spreading. It is not a problem that shows up on the news. It is not a problem that gets debated in Congress. But for the people who buy and sell gold and silver, it is becoming impossible to ignore. It is a tax, a sales tax on precious metals. Most people never think about this tax until the moment they are standing at a counter ready to pay. They pick out a coin or a small bar. They agree on a price. And then, almost as an afterthought, the seller adds a number on top. Sometimes it is small. Sometimes it is not. In some states, this tax barely exists at all. A buyer can walk in, purchase gold or silver, and walk out having paid only the price of the metal itself. But in other states, the story is very different. The tax can climb past 8%. In some cities, when local taxes are added on top of state taxes, they can climb even higher than 10%. Think about what that means in practice. A person walks in wanting to buy a modest amount of gold. Depending on where they live, they may end up paying 70, 80, even 90 extra dollars just in tax on a single purchase. For many buyers, that is enough to make them stop and think twice. For others, it is enough to make them drive somewhere else entirely. And that is exactly what is happening. Buyers who live near a state border have started making a simple calculation. They ask themselves, is it worth driving an hour or an hour and a half to a neighboring state where this tax does not exist? For a small purchase, the answer is usually no. The gas and the time are not worth the savings. But for a larger purchase, the math changes completely. Suddenly, that drive starts to look very reasonable. This creates a strange and difficult position for the shop owners who remain. They are not just competing with a shop down the street. They are competing with an entire state next door that offers something they cannot, a tax-free purchase. It would be easy to assume that dealers in high-tax states are simply struggling everywhere all the time. But the truth is more specific than that. This tax does not affect every transaction equally. Small purchases tend to survive it. A buyer spending $300 or $400 might grumble about an extra $25 in tax, but they usually still complete the purchase. The convenience, the trust in a local shop, and the simple desire to walk out the door with the item in hand, these things still matter to people. But as the purchase gets larger, the tax becomes harder and harder to justify. And this is where the real story begins to take shape. Because when a tax like this becomes large enough, it does not just affect how much a customer pays. It begins to affect what a business is even able to sell in the first place. This is the part most people never think about. A tax is often treated as a small, annoying detail, something added at the very end of a purchase and quickly forgotten. But for a business that depends on precious metals sales to survive, a tax like this is not a small detail. It is a force that can reshape the entire business, from the inventory on the shelves to the way transactions are structured behind the scenes. Which raises an important question. If a state imposes a tax steep enough to push away larger purchases and send customers driving across state lines, why would any precious metals dealer choose to stay and operate there at all? The answer is not simple, and it is not the same for every business. Some dealers leave, some dealers close entirely, but others make a different choice. They adapt. They restructure what they sell, how they sell it, and who they sell it to. They find ways to keep serving their customers and keep their doors open, even while operating under one of the heaviest tax burdens in the entire industry. Understanding exactly how they do this and what it reveals about the future of this industry requires looking closely at what happens on the other side of that tax. That story begins next. A heavy tax does not just take money from a buyer. It quietly rewrites the rules of an entire business, and nowhere is that more visible than in what a shop chooses to place in front of its customers. Picture two trays sitting side by side in a display case. One holds small items, priced close to the value of the metal itself. The other holds something larger, something that costs several times more. On paper, both trays represent the same kind of product. In practice, they represent two completely different business strategies. The small items move easily. A customer sees a fair price, adds a modest tax, and completes the purchase without much hesitation. But the larger items tell a different story. When a tax is calculated as a percentage, it does not stay the same as the price goes up. It grows right along with it. A purchase worth $1,000 might carry a tax bill worth dozens of dollars. A purchase worth several $1,000s can carry a tax bill worth hundreds. At a certain point, that tax bill becomes too large for most buyers to accept. And once that happens, a dealer faces a hard decision. Do they keep stocking large, expensive items that customers are unwilling to buy over the counter? Or do they shift their entire inventory towards smaller, lower-cost items that customers can still afford, tax included? Many dealers choose the second option. It is not because they prefer smaller items. It is because the tax leaves them little choice. Large gold purchases, the kind that once might have been a shop's most profitable transactions, become difficult to sell locally at all. The tax adds too much friction. The customer hesitates, does the math, and often walks away. This is where a second strategy begins to take shape. If a large purchase cannot easily be sold in person, it can sometimes be shipped instead. Many states do not require a tax to be collected when an item is shipped across state lines to a buyer who lives elsewhere. So a shop may keep its expensive inventory available, but only through shipping, not through a walk-in sale. The same item that would carry a heavy tax if sold in the store can be sold tax-free if it simply leaves the state in a different way. This single distinction, in person versus shipped, becomes one of the most important lines dividing how a modern precious metals business operates. It is no longer simply a question of what a shop sells. It becomes a question of how each sale is structured and where the transaction technically takes place. Rare and highly valuable items follow a similar pattern. Items worth many thousands of dollars are almost never displayed for a walk-in sale in a high-tax state. The math simply does not work. Instead, these items are often set aside entirely for buyers willing to have them shipped, allowing the sale to happen without the tax attached at all. None of this means dealers are trying to avoid paying what they owe. In every case, they are following the law exactly as it is written. But it does mean the tax itself is quietly shaping which products stay on the shelf and which ones disappear into a back room, waiting for a different kind of transaction. There's also a psychological side to all of this, one that matters just as much as the math. Most buyers have an unspoken limit in their minds, a point past which a tax stops feeling like a minor annoyance and starts feeling like a real loss. For many people, that limit sits somewhere around $20 or $30. Below that number, they shrug and pay it. Above that number, they begin to hesitate, compare, and sometimes walk away entirely. Dealers know this limit exists, even if no one has ever told them the exact number. They see it play out every day, purchase after purchase. And so, without ever discussing it openly, many of them begin pricing their inventory around that invisible line, keeping items just affordable enough that the tax does not push customers away. This is not simply a tax story anymore. It is a survival story. A story about how a single policy, applied unevenly across the country, forces business owners to rethink everything from their display cases to their shipping procedures just to keep their doors open. But adapting the inventory is only the beginning, because for the customers themselves, especially the larger buyers, there are other paths available too. Paths that remain completely legal, yet allow certain purchases to avoid the tax altogether. Understanding those paths is where the next part of this story begins. Every tax creates a reaction. And in the world of precious metals, buyers and sellers have quietly found their own ways to respond to a tax that many of them consider unfair. None of these responses break the law. In fact, every strategy used here exists because lawmakers built it into the tax code itself, whether they fully intended it or not. But knowing these paths exist, and knowing how to use them, separates buyers who pay full price from buyers who do not. The first and perhaps most interesting strategy involves trading one item for another. Many people are familiar with this idea from buying a car. A person trades in their old vehicle, and the value of that trade is subtracted from the price of the new one. The buyer only pays tax on the difference, not on the full price of the new car. The same idea applies to precious metals in several states. A customer holding silver can trade it in toward gold of equal value. And because no cash changes hands beyond the trade itself, no tax applies. The transaction is treated less like a taxable sale and more like an exchange. For someone looking to shift from one metal to another, this becomes a simple, legal way to avoid paying anything extra to the state. It is a small detail, but it changes behavior in a big way. Buyers who might have simply sold their silver and bought gold separately, paying tax along the way, instead choose to trade directly. The shop still profits from the transaction. The customer still gets what they want. The only party that ends up empty-handed is the state, which collects nothing from an exchange structured this way. A second workaround involves resale permits. In many states, a business that intends to resell an item rather than use it personally can apply for a permit that allows them to purchase inventory without paying sales tax up front. This makes sense from a policy standpoint. The tax is meant to apply once at the final sale to the end consumer, not multiple times, as an item passes through different hands along the way. But this also means that not everyone walking into a shop is treated equally. A small business owner with a resale permit can walk out with the exact same item as a private collector, yet pay nothing in tax, while the collector standing next to them pays the full rate. It is not favoritism. It is simply how the system is designed. Still, it highlights an uncomfortable truth. The tax burden falls almost entirely on ordinary individual buyers, not on the businesses moving large volumes of product. The third and perhaps most consequential workaround is shipping. As explored in the previous part, any item shipped to a buyer in a different state, one where the seller has no physical presence, generally avoids the seller's home state sales tax altogether. For expensive items, this is not a minor detail. It can mean the difference between paying nothing and paying hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars in tax. This creates a clear and growing divide. Buyers who are organized, informed, and willing to plan ahead, whether by using a shipping address out of state or by structuring a trade instead of a straight purchase, can often avoid this tax entirely. Buyers who simply walk in, pick something out, and pay on the spot cannot. They pay the full price every time, without exception. There is also a quieter cost to all of this, one that rarely gets discussed. Every workaround, every exception, every permit and shipping arrangement adds complexity to a business that used to be simple. A transaction that once involved handing over cash and walking out the door now sometimes involves paperwork, verification, and careful record keeping. Dealers must track who qualifies for an exemption, who does not, and be ready to prove it if ever asked. This is not free. It takes time, and time is money. So even as some buyers successfully avoid the tax, the businesses helping them do so are absorbing a hidden cost of their own, simply to keep everything compliant and legal. This uneven pattern, some buyers protected, others fully exposed, some transactions taxed heavily, others not at all, is not unique to a single state. It is a pattern that repeats itself in different forms across the country. And once that pattern is placed on a national map, a much bigger and more urgent picture begins to emerge. Step back far enough, and a single state's tax problem starts to look like something much larger. It stops being a local story and becomes a national one. Across the country, states have taken very different approaches to taxing precious metals, and the differences are striking. Some states have chosen to exempt gold and silver from sales tax entirely. Lawmakers in these states have generally accepted an argument that has circulated for years, that precious metals function more like money than like ordinary goods, and taxing them the same way a person is taxed for buying furniture or electronics does not really make sense. Under this view, taxing gold and silver is treated almost like taxing a dollar bill for being exchanged into quarters. Other states have landed somewhere in the middle. They may exempt purchases above a certain dollar amount, reasoning that small transactions are not worth the administrative effort, while still collecting tax on smaller everyday purchases. And then there are the states, like the one at the center of this story, that apply the tax broadly and heavily with little distinction between a small transaction and a large one. This unevenness creates something unusual in the American economy, a product that can cost noticeably more or less to buy, depending entirely on which side of an invisible line a person happens to stand on. Two buyers, living only a short drive apart, purchasing the exact same coin, can end up paying very different final prices simply because of where they happen to reside. For most goods, this kind of gap would correct itself quickly. Businesses would relocate, prices would adjust. But precious metals are different. They are compact, valuable, and easy to transport, which makes this tax gap unusually easy for informed buyers to exploit and unusually painful for local dealers to compete against. What makes this pattern worth watching closely right now is not just that it exists, but that it may be spreading. State governments across the country are facing familiar pressures, rising costs, strained budgets, and a constant search for new sources of revenue. Taxes on precious metals, once a minor and rarely discussed line item, are increasingly being viewed by some lawmakers as an area worth revisiting. This does not mean every state is moving in the same direction. Some continue to push toward full exemptions, arguing that taxing metals discourages saving and investment. Others face proposals to narrow or remove exemptions that have existed for years, especially during periods when state revenue is tight. The overall national picture is not one of uniform policy, but of quiet, ongoing negotiation, state by state, year by year. For buyers, this uncertainty carries real weight. A state with no tax today is not guaranteed to remain that way indefinitely. For dealers, the uncertainty is even heavier. A shop built around a favorable tax environment can find its entire business model challenged by a single change in state policy. This is the deeper reason this story matters beyond any one shop or any one state. It is not really about gold and silver taxes alone. It is about how ordinary people and small business owners respond when the rules governing their industry shift beneath them, sometimes with little warning. The dealers who adapt, who restructure their inventory, adjust their transactions, and stay informed about the changing landscape, tend to survive these shifts. Those who do not pay attention often find themselves the last to notice when the ground has already moved.